Her name was Isabeau Ardant, a miller's wife whose only crime was refusing to swear obedience to the man who claimed ownership of her body. When the guards dragged her into the dim chamber beneath the parish courthouse, she didn't scream. She listened. Because down there, beneath the dripping stone and the breath of mildew, there was a sound so faint it felt alive. The soft metallic whisper of a chain shifting against itself. That sound would follow her for days. It would become the soundtrack of her slow erasure. The officials called it an examination. The villagers called it purification. But everyone knew what this ritual truly was, a lesson written in bruises and rotting flesh. When the torchlight revealed the Ecraseur on a wooden table, a looped chain, a screw, and the arrogance of men who believed pain could teach moral order, Isabeau felt the first crack in her composure. She watched the magistrate's fingers brush the mechanism with the fondness of a priest touching a relic. And the chain whispered again, as if eager. Most viewers today recoil from devices like this, yet history left them everywhere, hidden in museums, tucked behind clinical descriptions, stripped of the voices of the women they crushed. That's why you're here. In this investigation, you'll witness three things: how a simple tool became a weapon of systemic obedience, why societies pretended it was medicine, and how women like Isabeau were forced to rot alive so that others would learn to bow. But first, we remain with her. The magistrate tightened his gloves, pretending he wasn't enjoying the power to decide whose pain counted. Isabeau's hands were bound behind her back, and the constables pressed her down, whispering scripture that had long since lost its mercy. In the corner, the chain glimmered, cold and patient, catching every shiver of torchlight. She could already imagine it tightening around her skin, not in a single violent burst, but in slow, choking increments. Bit by bit, turn by turn, day by day. This was the cruelty of the Ecraseur, the way it didn't rush, it didn't tear, it strangled. As the men argued over which impure growth deserved removal, whether the mark on her thigh was a woman's shame or a sign of her defiance, Isabeau realized something horrifying. They were not here to heal her, they were here to watch her collapse in silence. That chain would crush far more than flesh. It would suffocate her reputation, her defiance, her ability to stand in her own name. And the whisper of metal continued. Listen carefully to that sound, because it is more than a sensory detail. It is a symbol of every system that tightens slowly enough that the abused begin to doubt their own suffering. Every turn of the screw allows authority to pretend righteous purpose, even as women beg for death just to escape their own decaying bodies. This is not an aberration. It is a pattern, a structure, a blueprint reused across centuries. The guards leaned in close. One muttered, "Hold still, it's only pain." Only pain, spoken with the soft, rehearsed gentleness of a lullaby. That phrase has appeared in trial records, medical manuals, and confessional logs for hundreds of years. But beneath it lies the real doctrine. Your suffering maintains our order. The loop of chain was brought toward her, and Isabeau's breath hitched, not from fear alone, but from understanding. She had lived her entire life inside invisible constraints. Now they would make them visible, tangible, metal. And still, the chain whispered. If you've made it this far, stay with this investigation. The deeper we go, the more the historical mask will slip, revealing a system that wrapped metal around women's bodies and called it morality. If you value this kind of unflinching truth, this channel survives through viewers like you. Subscribe now, because the next chapter takes us into the mind of the men who designed this device, and the motives far more monstrous than the mechanism itself. The Ecraseur was deceptively simple, just a loop of chain and a screw. Yet its quiet efficiency made it one of the most psychologically devastating tools ever crafted. The mechanism relied on slow pressure, not spectacle. No slicing, no tearing, no sudden agony. Instead, the chain tightened around living tissue with a steady, unhurried cruelty. And every time that screw turned, the metal links released that same faint whisper Isabeau had heard in the chamber. The soft metallic breath that marked the shrinking boundary between her body and the machine meant to erase it.
But before the device touched her skin, we have to understand the men who wielded him. These were not executioners, not soldiers. They were clerics, physicians, magistrates, men wrapped in titles that sounded holy or educated enough to disguise the violence underneath. They believed impurity was not a condition, it was a threat. To them, women like Isabel were not individuals with lives and thoughts, they were potential breaches in the social order. One accusation of immodesty, one rumor of disobedience, and suddenly the body became a battlefield. The Ecraseur was merely the tool for enforcing the verdict they had already written. This is where the documentary turns clinical. Imagine the device in your hands, a chain loop, its links thick enough to bruise but narrow enough to dig. The screw mechanism sits on the side, heavy, deliberate. When turned, even by a fraction, the loop shrinks, muscles compress, nerves scream silently, blood flow falters. At first, the affected flesh goes numb, that deceptive stage when victims often believe they could endure it. But numbness is not mercy, it is the prelude. The tissue, now starved of oxygen, begins dying from the inside. Over hours, then days, the dead flesh rots while still attached to living nerves. Infection blooms like a slow curse. Fever creeps into the bloodstream, and all the while, turn by turn, the chain whispers against itself with every adjustment. The magistrate didn't apply the device in anger, he applied it with procedure. He recited guidelines from a medical manual that claimed the tool removes corrupt flesh and heals the soul of feminine aberration. This wasn't torture in their record books, it was rectification. The very word is a confession of intent, to correct, to reshape, to force. Isabel was forced to watch the chain lower toward her. The cold metal brushed her thigh first, and she flinched, not from pain, but from the realization that this object had touched dozens of women before her, that she was stepping into a lineage of silence. The cleric explained the process as if reading a recipe. We will tighten it each morning, 3 turns, no more, no less. His voice was calm, almost tender. That was the horror of it. These men believed themselves merciful because they moved slowly, because they believed restraint made brutality righteous. And that slow tightening served an additional purpose, psychological domination. Each night, the victims lay awake, listening to their own pulse throb against the unyielding metal. Each morning, they watched the screw turn again. Each day, the chain whispered as a loop strangled another ring of living flesh. This wasn't punishment, it was training, conditioning obedience through the inevitability of decay. And in this chamber, with the chain already tightening around Isabel, the truth became undeniable. The Ecraseur wasn't invented to remove growths. It was invented to remove resistance. The whisper of metal tightened once more. The first of many turns. And tomorrow, another.
By the second day, the chamber had changed. Not in its walls or its air, but in the way Isabel heard it. Every breath of the torches, every shuffle of boots, every dripping bead of damp from the ceiling, all of it faded beneath the single sound that ruled her existence, the faint metallic whisper of the chain. That whisper marked time better than any sundial. It was the pulse of her punishment, the slow clockwork of her decay. The first tightening had been shocking. The second was humiliating. But by the third morning, something worse had settled into her mind: anticipation. The human mind adapts even to cruelty, and that adaptation becomes its own kind of agony. She lay awake in the dark hours, listening to her heartbeat throb through the strangled tissue, knowing that at sunrise the screw would turn again, knowing the men above slept peacefully while her body slowly rotted inside a metal loop. Yet this is where the historical record becomes slippery, because the aftermath of such punishments was rarely written. Officials only documented the procedure, never the fever, the hallucinations, the smell of rotting flesh mixing with sweat and damp stone. But survivors' accounts, those rare, whispered testimonies, reveal a truth far more grotesque than any clerical notes. By the fourth day,
The flesh inside the chain ceased bleeding. That wasn't healing, it was death. The tissue darkened, hardened, then softened as infection claimed it. The pain became a constant tremor under her skin, radiating outward in sick ways.
Listen
she
closely.
begged for water, she begged
have
for
very
air.
little time
At one
left.
point, she even begged for the chain to be
child must be
tightened
moved
faster,
before dawn.
an impulse born not of madness, but of desperation to reach an end. And still, the metal whispered. But here's the part that history almost never acknowledges, the moment when the system realizes its cruelty has gone too far and scrambles to hide it. On the fifth morning, when the magistrate arrived with his cleric and 2 guards, expecting another routine turn of the screw, they found something they did not anticipate. Isabel was conscious, alert, and staring directly at them with an expression they had not seen before. Not broken submission, but clarity. Her fever had broken during the night, and in that brief window between agony and collapse, she understood something critical. If she died under their care, they would need to justify it, and justification required lies. She whispered, "Write whatever you want, but you know this is murder." The magistrate froze, not because the accusation mattered legally, but because she had spoken it with a calm that made the men uneasy. Authority thrives when victims are silent. A woman who refuses silence, even while rotting alive, is dangerous. He ordered the guards out. Then he leaned close, inspecting the wound. The flesh inside the chain had split, revealing pockets of yellow decay. A smell rose from it. Sweet, foul, unforgettable. Something in his face shifted. Not guilt, fear. If she died now, the community could claim divine disapproval. If she survived, she could expose their misuse of the device. Either outcome threatened the illusion of righteousness. This is where the unpredictable shock emerges in our investigation. Instead of tightening the chain, the magistrate loosened it. One turn, then another, and the whisper of metal, once the sound of suffocation, became the sound of reversal, of a man desperately trying to undo the cruelty he had authored. But it was too late, because when the chain slackened, something horrifying slipped free. A chunk of blackened tissue the size of a thumb, dropping onto the wooden floor with a wet tap. The cleric gagged. The magistrate stumbled backward. The guards refused to re-enter the room. The official records for that day contain only one sentence: the patient's corruption proved beyond remedy. But the true reason they halted the punishment was far simpler. They were terrified, not of her body, but of what she had made them see. And still, even as they fled the chamber, the loosened chain gave one last soft whisper. By the time the chain was removed, Isabeau was barely conscious. Her breath came in shallow, uneven pulls, each one scraping against the damp air of the chamber. The guards thought she was dying. The cleric hoped she was. The magistrate, ever concerned with optics, ordered her carried to a storage room above ground, a place where she could fade without staining the official narrative. But even there, wrapped in coarse sheets and trembling with fever, she could still hear it, the faint metallic whisper of the chain echoing in her mind. Trauma has a memory, and hers clung to sound. In the days that followed, the officials crafted their explanation. They claimed she had been partially cleansed. They insisted that the procedure had been medically indicated. They argued that her suffering was a natural result of her impure condition, not the device designed to torture her into obedience. And like countless bureaucrats across history, they replaced the truth with paperwork. But here is the unsettling reality that connects centuries of systemic violence. Institutions rely on silence. They do not fear pain, they fear witnesses. And Isabeau survived, barely. Fever took her for 2 days, delirium for 3 more. The rotting wound festered, flies gathered. Yet her mind, fractured, exhausted, trembling, held one final spark. She realized that what they feared was not her strength, but her testimony. So when the fever broke, when her vision steadied, when her voice returned in ragged whispers, she began to speak. To the midwife who secretly cleaned her wound, to the young servant who smuggled her fresh water, to the widow who visited under the guise of prayer, to anyone who entered the room and dared to ask what had truly been done to her. Her story spread, quietly at first, then with rising heat. Women whispered it to each other while kneading dough or fetching water from the well. Men heard it in taverns and shifted uncomfortably. Mothers warned their daughters. Priests warned their congregations not to fall for exaggerations. And still the story grew, because it was true. History tells us institutions collapse not when they lose power, but when people stop believing the story that supports that power. And the Ecraseur was a story, a myth wrapped in metal, a promise that obedience could be extracted one turn at a time. But when villagers heard what Isabeau endured, many realized the truth they had swallowed for too long. Impurity was not the crime, disobedience was. The device wasn't meant to cure anything, it was meant to break them. This is where the echo of the past becomes impossible to ignore, because versions of the Ecraseur still exist today, disguised under policy, reputation, shame, and social pressure. We no longer tighten chains around flesh, but we tighten expectations around women's bodies, voices, choices. We no longer call it purification, but we still justify suffering with words like discipline, tradition, or correction. And the slow strangulation of autonomy continues in courtrooms, households, workplaces, and institutions that swear they are protecting morality while enforcing control. If you listen closely, you can hear it. The same soft metallic whisper, a warning, a memory, a question. How many chains are still turning today? This final moment is where I must leave you with something deeper than shock, something heavier. Not horror for its own sake, but the recognition that cruelty survives when we refuse to look at it directly. Isabeau's story is centuries old, yet uncomfortably familiar. When systems harm under the banner of righteousness, when suffering is reframed as necessary, when the powerless are told to endure quietly, the past is not past. It breathes. So ask yourself, what chains are tightening around us now? And if you want more investigations that expose the machinery of historical cruelty, the stories buried under centuries of silence, and the systems that still echo today, make sure you're subscribed. Your support keeps these forgotten voices alive. Stay vigilant, stay aware, and above all, keep listening.